Okay, so today we're going to talk about plant enemies. Who are the main players that can harm plants? This will be Module 7 for this online part of the course, and your textbook has devoted a whopping 7 pages to enemy attack. Like I said before, I find it frustrating. The main things that kill plants are probably competition and enemies, and there's very little in your textbook, and you can imagine that the things that kill plants probably have very much shaped their form and function and their evolution. So we're going to think a bit about that today. So just to remind you, we're on the road to communities. We've talked about population ecology in the context of single populations and density-dependent processes. We've talked a little bit about how individual organisms respond to the environment, but also to other plants. And then sort of to get to communities, we have to think about all the ways that organisms interact, that multiple populations interact to form a community, because remember, a community is defined as groups of interacting populations, and so we need to think about all the ways that organisms can interact, right? And there's really only 3 main ways: mutualism, competition, and attack by enemies, which is what we're going to talk about today. So what is enemy attack? Right? So we could say that enemies of organisms are consumers. Remember, we already talked about consumer resource models. Plants are often consuming organic and inorganic molecules, but enemies at higher trophic levels are consuming individuals themselves, right? And so consumers tend to have many names. They're predators, they're herbivores, we could call them parasites, parasitoids, granivores, frugivores, detritivores, grazers, browsers. We could even talk about plants as being consumers in the sense that we talked about in terms of competition, right? Plants are themselves consuming things like water and nitrogen. And so I would argue there's really only 2 ways for an enemy to consume another individual, and those 2 categories are predators and parasites. So predators catch and consume individuals, and they remove them from the population, right? So this has clear population level consequences in terms of births and deaths, right? If you are trying to understand what happened with this depredation of this zebra, right, it's whatever the population of zebras is minus 1. So it has really clear demographic consequences. Parasites, on the other hand, consume only part of the living host. They might make it easy, if you have a really bad parasite, maybe you're more likely to die in the wild. It might reduce your birth rate because the parasite is taking some of the resources you have available for offspring, but it doesn't tend to remove individuals from the population, right? So both of these have clear demographic consequences in terms of births and deaths, but they're different. And that's why we make a distinction between predators and parasites. Right, and so population ecologists have used these types of models, so predator-prey or parasite-host relationships, as the basis for general theories of attack by enemies. But, of course, botanists are different, right? People don't usually talk about plant enemies this way. We call them herbivores. And the problem is that plants have actually posed special problems for population ecologists because the effect of herbivores doesn't have demographic consequences that are as clear. So based on those definitions, you might try to think about, is the average herbivore, like this beetle, is it more like a predator or like a parasite? Right, so herbivores are much more like parasites. They don't usually kill plants. But unlike most parasites, herbivores move easily. I mean, parasites can move between hosts, but herbivores can move between many, many hosts, whereas parasites don't usually do that. And so if you're imagining trying to make a demographic model, you'd have to take into account the fact that herbivores are moving between individuals within a plant population and potentially making choices about which ones to consume. Parasites make an individual sick, and so it might reduce their birth rates, but herbivores often just make plants smaller. It doesn't necessarily make them sick. It's just this beetle basically removed this leaf from the plant, but it has other leaves. And so unlike a parasite that can have sort of like, maybe I have 20% less babies if I have a parasite, now plants are smaller and all kinds of weird things happen. And this change in size has really complex population consequences. The other problem is that plants can often reproduce both sexually and asexually, which leads to all kinds of strange problems. So we're going to account for that in a minute, but let's think about for a minute, what is herbivory, right? So it's the consumption of part of a living plant without killing it. But sometimes herbivores do consume all of the living plant and kill it. So it's funny, the term herbivory as defined by botanists, usually sort of is either predation or parasitism if you were an animal person. And so, botanists like naming lots of different things, and so it can be useful to have different names for different kinds of herbivory, and I do expect you to know these. There aren't that many of them. So grainivores are seed predators, right? These are some of the herbivores that actually kill the individual. When they eat a seed, they kill it, right? So if you eat a bean, there's a little embryo inside that bean, you've killed an individual bean. When you have a burrito and it's full of beans, it's full of little baby plants that you're eating. Grazers, so you can think of squirrels as grainivores. Grazers are herbivores that eat grass and other low-growing plants. What they do is they usually clip them at ground level, but grasses have special adaptations that allow them to resprout. So their apical meristems are actually down near the ground, and the leaf comes out, protecting the apical meristem from the grazer. Browsers are herbivores that eat leaves and bark and green stems. So deers tend to be browsers. They have really small mouths that allow them to choose very specific species and very specific parts of plants. Frugivores are herbivores that eat fruits and sometimes kill the seeds and sometimes don't kill the seeds, as we'll see on, I think, what's supposed to be Friday's lecture, that sometimes plants are actually adapted to attract frugivores for seed dispersal. And then, of course, we have pathogens, right? So this department is botany and plant pathology, right? So pathogens are organisms that obtain food from living cells or tissues, causing disease. Pathogens are basically like parasites. So you can see there's some disease on this maple leaf. So those are the different kinds of herbivory that I'd like you to know for this class. There's only 5 of them. It's not so bad. And I also want to point out that sometimes plants can actually attack animals, which is a really cool adaptation that certain plants have. So you've probably all seen Venus flytraps, or these sundew plants, or pitcher plants. All of these are adapted to actually capture plants in nutrient-poor they're all adapted to capture animals in nutrient-poor environments because, it turns out that meat is a really good source of nitrogen and phosphorus and other kinds of things. And if you've never seen any of these, we actually have a pretty good collection of them in the botany collection in the greenhouse. Maybe next year you could stop by my office. I'd be happy to show them to you. Or you might get to see them in another class. So these are really cool. Relatively rare, but still really cool. So just like with competition, we can think about enemy attack at the individual level and the population level. And both of those have consequences as we get towards communities. So a lot is actually known about the effects of enemy attack at the individual level, right? So it generally removes tissues, it makes them smaller, and this has all kinds of consequences, right? So if this grasshopper eats the top of this plant, it's now smaller, which means if you think back to the board game we played, it potentially has less ability to do photosynthesis and excess capacity for doing nutrients relative to the capacity it has for photosynthesis, right? So if you imagine this game where you invested in 5 leaves, and now suddenly I take 3 of those away because I'm a grasshopper, right? Think about the consequences of what that would have for your plans for getting enough fruit in that board game we've been playing. So I think I'm going to stop the video here, and we'll pick it up in the next video where we talk about the different ways that plants actually protect themselves from herbivores at the individual level.